Shalom, Baruchim Abayim, and welcome to Sheve'im Pani LaTorah, to 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. I'd like to greet everybody, a Chag Chashav Sameach, once again, a happy Passover to everybody at the time of the recording of this teaching. And B'ezras Hashem, I was trying to make sure I got this teaching uploaded before the end of Pesach, and it'll probably be up right towards the end of Pesach. And Chutz Haaretz, outside the land of Israel, Pesach is kept for an 8th day, okay? And normally, of course, there's 2 Seders, which is both on the 15th and going into the 16th of Nisan, which is when we count the Omer, and also hopefully you're counting Sfirat HaOmer as well. However, in Eretz Israel, there's only 1 Seder observed, and the Chag is only kept for the first initial 7 days, not an 8th day, as is customary amongst other holidays that we hold as well in the Jewish Hebrew calendar. So, with that said, I want to discuss a very interesting topic here for the teaching of Pesach. And so I have subtitled this teaching, The Dreadful Retelling of the Exodus of Egypt. It's a very interesting title, but it's based on some inquiries that I have done, some research I have done throughout my years when it comes to the holiday of Passover. Some that are mostly overlooked by the greater part of the Jewish community, something that most people don't really ponder upon. Not that people are superficial or completely ignorant of the matter, it just really doesn't, I would say, come across their radar when it comes to this aspect of the holiday. Now, in a previous teaching that I did on Pesach, which I am entitled in Decoding the Haggadah, I explained in that teaching how the Haggadah reveals the secret for the redemption. And in that teaching, I explained how the Haggadah is divided into 2 parts. The first part is dedicated to the actual retelling of Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? That's the very first part that leads up to our meal that we eat. And so a lot of it, we're recalling events that happened and that transpired and what Chazal bring down. And then we pause, we eat the meal, we say Birchat Hamazon, the blessing after the meal, and then we go through the final stages of the second part of the Haggadah. And that second part is dedicated to teaching us how to create the redemption, which is essentially known as the second Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay, and if you'd like to learn more about that, then please go take a look at that teaching. But in that teaching, I mentioned that the redemption of the second Yetziat Mitzrayim would mirror, or it would parallel, the first Yetziat Mitzrayim. And this is actually brought down from a verse in the Tanakh in Sefer Micah chapter 7:15, in which Hashem spoke to the Navi and said, Kimei setecha me'eretz Mitzrayim ar'enu niflaot, that according to the days of your coming out of Eretz Mitzrayim, I will show unto you marvelous things, niflaot, pele, wonders, phenomenon, okay? So in other words, which indicates that as we read through the Torah, the Chumash Shemot, we're very, very familiar that when God intervenes on behalf of the Jewish people, he does it through the title Hashem, right? Not through Elohim, not through El Elyon, or any of the titles of God that are associated with what we call Midah Hadin, but rather with a title that is known as Midah HaChesed, the attribute associated with kindness. And this is not how God basically interacted with Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And so we see that a lot of phenomenon took place with the 10 plagues, the eventual Exodus, Kiryat Yam Suf, which is essentially the last day of Pesach, which I like to point out here as a little note, and I'll talk about this towards the end of the teaching, is that the last day of Passover, the 7th day, the last Achach HaMatzot, the last day that we eat matzah, okay, marked the time in which the Jewish people crossed the Yam Suf that we call the Red Sea. Interesting title, and we'll explore that shortly. And I explained in previous teachings in the past that when we get to the fall holidays, specifically with Sukkot, or as it's also called Chag HaAsif, the Feast of Ingathering, as it's also known in the Torah, that Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot, actually runs parallel to the 7th day of Pesach. that both events were actually connected with each other upon the initial departure of the Jews from Mitzrayim. The only difference is that Sukkot is celebrated 6 months later, after Nisan, in the month of Tishrei, and I have plenty of teachings explaining why, because the Jews' interruption with the Yehezqel, the departure of the Shekhinah, the return of the Shekhinah, and things of that nature. And the actual concept of a sukkah, what does it represent? Is it the Yani HaKavod? Is it actual sukkahs, tabernacles? I talk about all those in previous teachings and explain why we end up observing Sukkot later in Tishrei versus its original connection with the departure from Mitzrayim. But one of the things that's important to point out is that Hoshana Rabbah is associated with Melchemet Gog and Magog, the war of Gog and Magog. And I have many teachings on that, explaining what that is. As well, there's much speculation in the world regarding what is Gog and Magog. Is it World War III? We're living in a quite unique time, a time of uncertainty, where we see a lot of the political powers that will be on the scene right now, and a lot of the talking heads of the Western mainstream media would have their people believe that Russia and China right now are eventually strong allies, and that they are on the verge of creating this World War III. China is surrounding Taiwan in their war games. We see what's happening with Russia and Ukraine is the poor victim, and Zelensky, and all this other shtuyot that is out there. And in the religious world, people believe that, oh, it's the Gog and Magog, or it's the apocalypse, or it's this and that. It's Armageddon. And people buy into this, and they have no clue what they believe because they're listening to some mainstream media. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The interpretations and the narratives that are being put forth by the establishment are all wrong. They're meant to deceive you, okay? And that's another topic for another time. And also, at this point, I don't feel like being censored by the powers that be on YouTube, so let us digress and focus on the topic at hand. But nonetheless, Hoshana Rabbah, which is associated with Melchemet Gog and Magog, parallels the last day of Pesach. And the last day of Pesach, or Chag HaMatzot, is what? Kiryat Yam Suf. It's the splitting of the Red Sea. And when you take a look at those two passages, and most people are oblivious to this at Sukkot because they think they're sitting in their sukkah, they're enjoying a meal, they're happy, right? It's Zaman Simchotenu, a time of being joyful and happy. They're not really paying attention to the severity of the theme of that day. And this is why when you read the Haftarot, okay, to the Torah portions for Sukkot, we're reading for Sefer Yehezqel, we're reading for Sefer Zechariah, and both of those Nevi'im are describing Melchemet Gog and Magog, okay? And this is why when we take a look at Kiryat Yam Suf, they appear to be geographically separated, they don't appear to have anything in common, but actually they have much in common. And so it's only once you understand the spiritual root, okay, of Melchemet Gog and Magog, Kiryat Yam Suf, do you have a better understanding of what the Torah is even talking about, let alone paying attention to the mainstream media and some religious, puppet up there trying to tell you to buy their latest books to prepare for the coming end of the world, okay? So with that said, it's very important to point that out because I'll touch base upon that shortly at the end of this teaching as well, or towards the end of this teaching. So clearly what we see here is that Micha mentions that there will be a supernatural, or what we would perceive as supernatural, there'll be a niflaot, a phenomenon taking place in the end of days, the second yetziat Mitzrayim, that will parallel the first. Now that's very, very important because when you read this passage and when you sit down at the Seder, okay, in preparation for the Haggadah Shel Pesach, you have to ask yourself the question, what were the marvelous things that Hashem showed to Am Israel? Now, one could say it was the 10 plagues, right? I mean, we sit there, we dip our finger in the cup, and we sprinkle it out every time. The Magid, the individual telling the Seder, the Haggadah, the Seder, tells the story. There's, a plague of blood, a plague of choshech, of darkness, and we, splatter wine, so it looks like bloodshed, right? Like Hashem was basically pummeling the powers of Mitzrayim, all right? And so it looks like bloodshed. And we think that that is one of the phenomena. From our present time in history, okay, we have to ask ourselves the question, can we truly understand or even comprehend the catastrophic events that led to what we call yetziat Mitzrayim. Can you even comprehend it? I doubt it. Okay, I seriously doubt it. When we refer to the 10 plagues in the Haggadah, from our current point of time, we are simply reading words from the Haggadah. That's all we're doing. But how many of us truly know what is it or was it that transpired during Yetziat Mitzrayim? At the beginning of the Haggadah, when we read, or I should say we read, that a person who elaborates upon the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that individual is praiseworthy. They are mishubach. We read here at the very beginning. The Haggadah says over here, and I think I jumped ahead. Here we go. It says, Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Mitzrayim, Egypt, Mitzrayim. V'yutzi enu Adonai Eloheinu, and Hashem our God, our power misham b'yah hazachar u'v'zerua netuya. He took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Ve'ilu lo hotzi hakadosh baruch hu et avotenu miMitzrayim. And if the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Mitzrayim, then we, harei anu uvanenu uvanei va'enu, our children, our children's children, would have been enslaved, hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim, to Pharaoh in Egypt. The Haggadah goes on to say, va'afilu kulanu, chachamim kulanu, nevo'im kulanu, zekenim kulanu, yodi'im et haTorah. And even if we were all wise, all understanding, all experience, and all versed in the Torah, we would nevertheless be obligated. Mitzvah aleinu, it is incumbent, a commandment upon us, l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim, to tell over the story of the departure, the exodus from Egypt. V'chol hamarbe l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim harei ze mishubach. And he who elaborates upon the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is worthy of praise. The Haggadah reveals that by expanding upon the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim, it says, V'chol hamarbe, who increases, literally all who increase, l'saper, to tell, b'yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. One who does that comes to a true understanding of what took place in ancient times. One who understands what took place in the past will have a greater understanding of what will take place in the future, because what was will be. Ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh, as Shlomo HaMelech says, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, contrary to the popular understanding, okay, that the plagues that were unleashed upon Mitzrayim, that those plagues were an isolated event, that it was just between the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, and the Jews, okay? Contrary to that opinion, the actual events leading to the departure of the Jews from Mitzrayim were the result of a global cataclysmic event that changed the world. This was not local, it was not isolated. This was an event that the Creator used that had a massive global impact. It affected millions of people. Now, for many years, I had been studying what would be called the catastrophe cycle of Earth. And my studies on this topic actually originate with the late and respected Jewish psychoanalyst, Immanuel Velikovsky. While Velikovsky was regarded as an apostate, a heretic to the mainstream scientific community, his actual teachings were later to be found very accurate. And he's considered still an apostate to some branches of the mainstream science and even religious communities who have a certain theological narrative that they like to go by. And so they like to ignore his work. And he's written many books. There's some here on the screen you can see. Velikovsky taught that the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim that we read in the Torah were caused by the planet Noga, which in Hebrew means the planet Venus, which originally was a comet that came into existence from the planet Cetic, which is the planet Jupiter. That Jupiter gave birth to Venus through an electrical discharge. And there's a whole topic on this, if you never heard about this, that I have to get into for another day, because this teaching here is just breaking the ice. It's an icebreaker to introduce some of you to the subject, because once again, this is a topic that doesn't resonate. It's not on the radar of many people when it comes to Pesach. Okay, they go through the motions, they have a Seder, they eat matzah for 7 days, they're having a family reunion. Most Jewish people take vacation at this time, and then it's back to business as usual. Okay, it's much deeper than that. And so Venus never was a planet. It came into existence and became a planet and had interacted with the earth. And so the events that we read in the Torah, okay, the 10 plagues and the events that happened amongst the non-Jewish nations at the time were all from this event of Venus interacting with the earth. The interaction of Venus and the earth was caused by what would be considered an electrical discharge of the two planets that caused massive cataclysmic damage, affecting the lives of millions of people on earth. And this is something to go on topic to another day, because I also realize if you're someone who is steeped or learned in some of the mainstream branches of science, this may seem to be preposterous to you, like ridiculous, because it deals with subjects that science doesn't even have answers for, let alone somebody coming with this concept and electrical discharges. This also will fit the model of what is called the electric universe. It's another topic to get into as well. And like I said, I don't have time to get into all the facts here today with it, but I will be sharing some of it pertinent to the teaching of Pesach. So as a student, I wouldn't say he was a Talmid Chacham in the sense of what it's used, but Yehezqel was fluent in many languages. Possibly you consider him a polyglot. He was very well learned in Talmud Torah as well. Okay, Yehezqel was able to actually reconcile the events of yetziat Mitzrayim. In other words, proving that what the Torah recorded is historically accurate by comparing those events and the Hebrew calendar, okay, with the calendars and the historical writings of the non-Jewish nations who happen to record the same cataclysmic events that we find in the Torah. In other words, the timeline that the Hebrew calendar records about these plagues and the events leading to the Exodus, even the wilderness journey of the Jews to Har Sinai and eventually to Yehoshua, succeeding Moshe Rabbeinu and bringing the Jews into the Promised Land, with a lot of the phenomenon that happened there. These can be reconciled with many of the non-Jews as far as the Aztecs in South America, as far as the East with the old Yahoo Empire in China. They all simultaneously say the same thing, and they record the actual destruction that was happening in their local lands based upon this global event. In fact, if you take a look at the writings of the 4th century grammarian Servius, he wrote that the appearance of Venus caused a red dusting upon the Earth's surface, and that the red dust from Venus caused parts of the oceans, lakes, and rivers to turn into a pigment of blood red. And according to the Quiche Maya, which is a manuscript preserved from the Mayan people, during the time period of Yetziat Mitzrayim, there were large earthquakes in which the sun's motion was interrupted and all the local waters turned into blood. Also, we find an Egyptian document that is well known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, which happens to be a contemporary to the 10 plagues that are recorded in the Torah. There in the Ipuwer Papyrus, it describes how the waters in Mitzrayim were filled with blood. We read here in what's considered chapter 2, 5 through 6, then 10, 3, and also verse 10, then chapter 3, 10 through 13. It's recorded there, plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting human beings and thirst after water. So it's describing people essentially dying because they're not hydrated. That is our water. That is our happiness. What shall we do in respect thereof? All is ruin. And if you know anything about ancient Egypt, it was well irrigated. compared to the desert that it is today. It was vastly irrigated. And in fact, the Paros of old considered themselves as these half-god, half-men entities that when standing in the Nile, they considered themselves the gods of this vast resource that brought life, irrigation to their country, which is also kind of ironic considering that when Moshe and Aharon challenged Paro in those days, the Midrash records on one early morning, Moshe went to Paro while the people were asleep, because Paro said that as a god, he never had to use, he never had any bowel movements or had, excuse me, had a urine because he was a god. And so what he would do is early in the morning, he would go and relieve himself in the Nile River. So while he was in the middle of using the bathroom, Moshe and Aharon popped up on him and caught him in the act, right? How embarrassing. So in a sense, what we learn from the Yippur papyrus here is that their whole source that brought them Parnosa and life is ruined. Now it's interesting, these passages here run directly parallel to what we find written in the Torah. You go to Shemot, Exodus chapter 7, verse 20 to 21, and also verse 24. It says over here, that all the waters of the river, when it says Bayor, the Yor, that refers to the Nile, Ledam, it turned to blood. And also, Adam Eretz Mitzrayim, there was blood throughout the entire land of Mitzrayim. The river stank, right? Became completely undrinkable. And also in verse 24, and all of Mitzrayim dug around the river for water to drink, right? Trying to go deeper, trying to find a reservoir or a spring or something. And it says they could not drink any of the water of the Nile, of the river there. So all these passages here, definitely they coincide with what we find in the historical writings of Egypt. Commenting on this, Yehezqel wrote in regards to the nations outside of the Egyptian story, the Mitzrayim story, and his worlds in collision. He says here, the summit of mountainous Thrace received the name Hamus. And I also apologize if I'm pronouncing some of these words wrong. I didn't get to study the words in great detail, so my pronunciation is off. For some people who may be more learned in it, I do apologize in advance. And it's Hamus, and also Apollodoros, related to tradition, apparently a Greek historian, of the Thracians, that the summit was so named, and obviously it's referring to their mountain area, because of the stream of blood which gushed out of the mountain when the heavenly battle was fought between Zeus and Typhon. And Typhon was struck by a thunderbolt. It is said that the city in Egypt received the same name for the same reason. So what Yehezqel does, and I'm going to continue with the quote, is that to be able to validate the events in the Torah is by finding other historical documents by non-Jews recorded at the same time, or at least which, if you convert the Hebrew calendar, would exist in that same period, and finding something, some type of phenomenon in which in their mythology and their belief system demarcates a time in which there was some great change taking place. So obviously when he talks about Zeus and Typhon, that obviously this was the Greeks' mythological way of trying to describe something happening, okay, a cataclysmic event. Okay, it's not that they were, in a way, personifying these so-called beings, not to be taken as actual deities, which tragically unfolded as years went by. People began to deify these things, but these were events that people basically saw and trying to make sense of. He goes on to say afterwards that this mythology, which personified the forces of the cosmic drama, described the world as colored red. In one Egyptian myth, the bloody hue of the world is ascribed to the blood of Osiris, the mortally wounded planet god. In another myth, it is the blood of Set or Apopi. In the Babylonian myth, the world was colored red by the blood of the slain Tiamat, the heavenly monster. And then he goes on to say afterwards, the Finnish epos of Kalevala describes how in the days of the cosmic upheaval, the world was sprinkled with red milk. The Altai Tartars tell of the catastrophe when blood turns the whole world red, and a world conflagration follows. The Orphic hymns refer to the time when the heavenly vault, mighty Olympus, trembled fearfully, and the earth around shrieked fearfully, and the sea was stirred, troubled with its purple waves, indicating a change in the color of the ocean. So we see here that across the Mediterranean, other nations were experiencing the same event, and they recorded it the best they could in their own language, according to their own understanding and belief system. Also, in his World of Collisions, Velikovsky, he asked the question, why is the Yam Suf, I mean, that's what we call it in Hebrew, but why is it called the Red Sea? Sometimes you'll see it translated as the Sea of Reeds, but it's called the Red Sea. If a sea is called, let's say, the Black Sea, or even, let's say, a White Sea, those names may be based on the coloring of the water. If it's called a Black Sea, it would be based on the dark coloring of the water. If, let's say, if it was called the White Sea, that would be based on the brightness of any ice and snow associated with the water. So if anyone's ever been to the Yam Suf or Red Sea, what color does it have? It's not red. It has a deep blue color to it. So why was it called the Red Sea? Velikovsky answers that question. And he says, like all the water in Egypt, the water on the surface of the Sea of the Passage, Yam Suf, Red Sea, was of red tint. It was, of course, not this mountain or that river on that sea exclusively that was reddened, thus earning the name Red of Bloody. Or Bloody, it should have been. That's a typo on my behalf. As distinguished from other mountains and seas. But crowds of men, wherever they were, who witnessed the cosmic upheaval and escaped with their lives, ascribed the name Hamus or Red to particular past places there. So what we see here, according to Velikovsky, is that this became a well-known name for the Red Sea. It wasn't just something isolated in the Torah. All nations around that time understood this, and it was because of a cosmic event. He goes on to say, the phenomenon of blood raining from the sky has also been observed in limited areas and on a small scale in more recent times. And he's talking about from his time span when he was alive. One of these occasions, according to Pliny, was during the consulship of Menaeus Achilus and Gaius Porcicus. Babylonians too recorded red dust and rain falling from the sky. Instances of bloody rain have been recorded in diverse countries. The red dust, soluble in water, falling from the sky in water drops does not originate in clouds, but must come from volcanic eruptions or from cosmic spaces, comets, meteorites, things of that nature. The fall of meteorite dust is a phenomenon generally known to take place mainly after the passage of meteorites. This dust is found on the snow of mountains and in polar regions. And he's right, because even in today's day and age, with explorations in the scientific community, in which they have discovered red dusting on snow and stuff, it has been ascribed to dust falling from meteorites or other cosmic activity happening in our universe, falling down to the earth. However, when there's something that happens with the earth, and when there's an impact or contact, there's a greater portion of this red dust falling here. Now, this is fascinating because the Torah tells us that the sixth plague, known as the plague of boils, it was caused from cosmic dust. We go back here to Exodus chapter 9, verse 8 through 9. And Vayomer Adonai el Moshe v'Aharon kechu lachem melo chach fenechem piach. Hashem said to Moshe and Aaron, take for yourselves handfuls of furnace soot, okay? And therefore let Moshe toss it Hashemaima, up skyward, heavenwards, le'enei paro, before the eyes of Pharaoh. V'haya la'avach el kol eretz Mitzrayim v'haya el ha'adam ve'el ha'behema lishchin. It will become dust over the entire land of Mitzrayim, and it will become boils. Okay, shechin, poreach, erupting into blisters. Now, since shechin literally means something hot, like when the skin overheats, but this is a chemical reaction per se. Okay, my brain is like just paused on me here. Like what's going on here, brain? Let's think here. Is basically an allergic. There we go. Allergic. Okay. I apologize about that. Allergic reaction, but it's chemically induced though. Allergic reaction upon the skin, and it's going to happen to man and beasts throughout the land of Mitzrayim. Is what's going to happen. Fascinating. The Ramban Nachmanides in his commentary to this Torah portion, he explains that this was all produced. It was a decree from the Creator, okay, in which it became produced in the air, meaning the air quality, meaning this is something that took place from the, the higher atmosphere, such as cosmic dust, as Yehezqel says. Ramban says, and it shall become like small dust. Is that the dust which will be produced, and that place from the soot will bring the boils over all the land of Mitzrayim. As he infected the air to do so, it being a decree of the Supreme One. The Supreme One, Yehezqel, he commented on this, and he says, our planet, meaning at that time when this happened, during the 6th plague of boils, entered deeper into the tail of Venus. The dust was a forerunner of meteorites striking the earth. Now, once again, this time, Venus was not a planet. It was a comet that came into existence from out of Jupiter, according to Yehezqel. But as it interacted with Earth, and the Earth went to the tail part, this was taking place during the 6th plague of boils. Now, he says this eventually, the next episode was a forerunner for meteorites. And it just happens to be that the Torah tells us the 7th plague is called the plague of Barad. Now, the word Barad is usually translated as hail, right? However, according to rabbinic interpretations, this is not the Barad of hail that comes from like a thunderstorm or tornado, like it's ice. This is meteorites, actually. We go over here to the 7th plague, Shemot, Exodus chapter 9, verse 18, and then we'll take a look at verse 22 to 25. Moshe is telling Paro, behold, at this time tomorrow I shall rain a very heavy barad. It says hail. But I'm going to use barad for the remaining part of the translations because it doesn't mean hail in the normal sense of hail. This is fascinating because this impact, this meteorological event, okay, is going to be of such proportions. It has never been in the land of Mitzrayim from the day it was founded ve'ad atah until now. Meaning that this is not a normal thunderstorm. This is even not a freak F5 tornado event that's about to happen. This is something that's never happened in the history of Mitzrayim, Moshe is saying. Now we go up to the verses 22 to 25 when it actually happens. Vayomer Adonai Moshe, Hashem says to Moshe, Nete et yadecha al hashamayim, stretch forth your hand towards the heaven. V'hi varad b'cho eretz Mitzrayim, and there will be barad in the entire land of Mitzrayim. El ha'adam ve'al ha'behama ve'al cho esev, on man, on the beast, on the grass hasadega, the field be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the entire land of Mitzrayim. So in other words, the Torah is saying that what's about to hit Egypt is going to afflict and destroy everything and everyone. Torah goes on to say that Moshe et matrichu hashemayim, he raised his staff towards the heaven. Va'adonai natan kolot uvarad v'tihalach ish arsa. And it says Hashem sent thunder and barad. That's interesting. I'm going to explain it in a minute. First, it doesn't say he sent, but literally natan, he gave. It's kind of like a gift. Yeah, here matan barad, right? Nice, like matan Torah. Here you get barad instead. And it says there was barad and aish, fire, wind, earthward. And then it says afterwards, Vayamter Adonai barad eretz Mitzrayim, and Hashem rained barad upon the land of Mitzrayim. Vayihi v'ra ve'esh mitla kachat betoch habarad. And it says there was barad and fire flaming amid the barad. It was kaved me'od, very heavy, okay? Now, we have heard stories and we've seen possibly many times on TV, or maybe somebody's physically experienced, when you have some freak weather come through an area, just enough where you have cold air and hot air colliding, it can produce softball-sized hail, right? And one may perceive that this is what the Torah is describing when it says that this was kaveh me'od, very heavy barad. Not really, okay? Kaveh me'od is describing something way more denser, way more heavier than softball-sized ice hail, all right? And we'll see. Asher lo haya, and the Torah repeats here, this has never happened. Kamohu b'chol eretz Mitzrayim me'az hayata legoy, and the entire land of Mitzrayim, ever since it became a nation. Ever since. They've never experienced this before. And so what we see here is that the Torah is describing this is a freak event. This is something of supernatural proportions. It goes on to say afterwards, during the event, Vayach habarad b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. The barad struck the entire land of Mitzrayim. Et kol asher, everything was afflicted that was in the field. Me'adam, human beings, va'abehema, to all types of animals. All of the grass of the field. The barad struck every tree of the field. Shiber, it smashed it to pieces. Smashed it. So what are we learning here? The Torah is describing a meteorological event. These were meteorites. Okay? Much more than meteorological or weather. I mean, meteorites attacking the earth. This is what's actually going on here. Very similar to what happened back in Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? That was just destroyed by meteorites. The Sforno, in his commentary to this passage, he points something out very interesting about the Torah's language of using the word kolot, which is translated as thunders. It doesn't mean thunders. Take a look here. Sforno says here to Exodus 9:25, driven by the immense velocity and pressure of the descending hailstones. So he's describing here a change in the atmospheric conditions. Hailstones, right, is barad, but it's just a general translation. It says the heat generated in the atmosphere resulted in unnatural sounds being heard everywhere. Both hard and soft plants were destroyed by the barad. Interesting. The Sforno mentioned that the heat generated in the atmosphere is what caused this apparent thundering sounds. Then this is interesting because the Torah says these sounds came from Hashem. Once again, going back here to Exodus 9:22, Adonai Natan, literally Hashem gave. Kolot uvarad v'hit chalach eish arza. Okay, Hashem gave. We translate thunder and barad. Okay, the word kolot here that's highlighted in red is translated as thunder or thunderings, but that's inaccurate. Literally in Hebrew, kolot literally means voices. That's what it means. And so if the seventh plague of barad was a supercharged thunderstorm accompanied with hail, like it normally has within its system, then the Torah would have used the Hebrew word ra'am instead of kolot. All right? Because ra'am means thunder. The word kolot is being described as the figurative voice of God that was manifested as meteorites smashing into the earth. Now, the other place in which we find the word kolot used is with the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Mount Sinai. We go over to Exodus 19:16. Vayhi vayom hashlishi biyot habocher. And the third day was morning. Vayhi kolot uvarakim ve'na kaved el hahar. There we see the concept of kaved, heaviness. There were thunders, literally voices, meteorites, and lightning, electrical discharge, and a heavy cloud upon the mountain. V'chol shofar chazach me'od. And there was a sound, it sounded like a shofar. It was very, very strong, very loud. And the entire people in the camp shuddered. In other words, the Jewish people, they were very scared, all right, to put it, very, very kind here, without probably, going to the bathroom on themselves. It was not something that was for the faint of heart to experience, basically. Now, I want to point something out here as well as a side note in regards to what we're reading. Over at Masechet Brachot, Chazal mentioned that the cosmic upheaval that was experienced during Yetziat Mitzrayim, that this lasted all the way into the days of Yehoshua ben Nun, because we read in Sefer Yehoshua, also supernatural phenomenon of the sun and the moon standing still at the same time. That these events that transpired were all linked and many, many years went by. This was not something that happened in one day, 1 week. These happened over a time span of many, many years. Let's take a look here. Some very fascinating information recorded by Chazal. This is in Brachot 54a to 54b. Quite a lengthy passage, but to get to the gist of it, you need to read it. Tanan Rabbanan. So this is brought down in a Baraita, additional piece of Mishnaic literature. And Chazal mentioned over here that if one sees the place of the crossing of the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, the crossing of the Yarden, the Jordan River, which happened under Yehoshua's leadership, the place of the crossing of what's known as the canyons of Arnon, or the stones of El Gavish in the descent of Beit Horon, the stone of Og, the king of Bashan, they wanted to throw at Israel. The stone upon which Moshe sat when Yehoshua waged war against Amalek. And so that would be found in Parsha Beshalach, where Moshe ascended and he sat down, right? That whole story there. Or the remains of the wife of Lot, which also is related to another phenomenon of asteroids or meteorites slamming into the earth with Sodom and Gomorrah. Or the wall of Jericho, which was swallowed in its place. That's also, by the way, connected with this same cataclysmic upheaval, according to Velikovsky. For all of these, one must do what? One must actually hoda'ah v'shevach livnei hamakom. They must give complete praise and thanks to Hashem. Okay? Goes on to say, it is understandable that the place of crossing the Yam Suf or Red Sea warrants a blessing, because it says there in Exodus chapter 14, verse 22, and it says, Vayavo'u v'nei Israel betoch hayam bayabasha, that the children of Israel came within the sea on dry land. And yes, that crescendo, that climax of the 7 days of the splitting of the Red Sea was also simultaneously linked to this great cataclysmic event, as also Velikovsky documents, which I don't have time to go into all the details about it. I'll have to preserve that for another time. Likewise, a place of crossing the Yarden or the Jordan, as it says in Joshua 3:17. The Kohanim, the bearers of the Aron Habrit, or the Ark of the Covenant Hashem, stood firmly on dry ground, and all of Israel crossed dry ground until the entire nation finished crossing the Jordan. That event is also linked to the same catastrophe, the cataclysmic upheaval that transpired since Yetziat Mitzrayim. Going on, it says afterwards, but from where is it known to us that a miracle is performed at the place known as the crossing of the canyons of Arnon? Therefore it is said, quoting from Numbers 21, verse 14, it's B'Sefer Milchamot Hashem, in the war, the book of the wars of Hashem, it says, Et Vahev Besufa. Okay. The Baraita, another additional piece of missionary literature, interprets that ambiguous phrase of Et Vahev Besufa. That means that there were two Mitzrayim who were walking in the rear of the camp of Israel. And it says that when the Jews were going to pass through the canyons of Arnon, the Amorites came, and it says here that they made caves in the mountainside for themselves in which they hid. Now, this passage here, let me explain it because it has some type of ambiguous meaning. According to the rabbis, in this passage, I'll pull it back on the screen, I have it highlighted in yellow, the Vav, okay, when it says Vahev right there, it's the second word, okay, Vahev. That Vav is understood as a conjunctive, which means and. Okay, when it says Et, Aleph Tav, which is a particle there, it's never usually translated. It usually is like Ata means to come into, something coming into the picture. Et Vahev, okay, basically you have a conjunctive. So Et and Hev is how you should translate that. The word here, Bisufa, is Bisof. Suf is the end, like Yam Suf or Yam Sof. Sof means the end of. So Bisufa, Bisof, it means the end of, which figuratively means, or it's colloquially, it's another way of saying in the rear of, or at the end of, like the end of the camp, the end of the caravan, the rear of the caravan. right? Describing the Jews marching. The reference to Mitzrayim are two individuals who were classified as a Mitzorah, someone afflicted with the skin disease that the Torah calls sara'at, okay, that manifested upon them for lashon hara, or for motzi ra, for bringing evil out. That's a contraction of the word Mitzorah. These individuals that had sara'at were at the rear of the camp because they had to be quarantined, isolated from the remaining part of the machne, the camp of Israel. And so they had to be at the rear. So these individuals, the sages are saying, were the ones who witnessed something that the rest of the camp of Israel did not describe. So returning back here to the passage in Brachot, it says, they said, meaning the Mitzrayim, or the Amorites, excuse me, who are basically setting an ambush for the Jews. When the Jews pass through here, we will kill them. Okay? But they did not know that the ark was traveling in front of the Jews and this is interesting. As the Ark of the Covenant was going ahead of the Jews, Chazal says that the Ark was leveling mountains before them, like literally destroying mountains and turning them into valleys. Pay attention to that, okay? And it says, when the Ark came to the canyons of Arnon, the mountains on the two sides cleaved together and killed the Amorites, whose blood flowed down to the canyons of Arnon, when Et and Hav came, the two Mitzrayim. They saw the blood issuing from between the mountains. They went and told the Jews, and they uttered a song of praise. This is the explanation of that which is written in Numbers 21:15. And an outpouring of the canyons when it veered to dwell at Ar and leaned against the border of Moab. Now let me explain what this means. The canyons of Arnon were basically a very narrow valley between two steep, tall mountains that ran along the border between Moab and the land of the Amorites. The Jews, in their journey 40 years in the wilderness, which should have been 11 days, but turned 40 because of their unbelief, they had to pass through this valley on their way to Eretz Israel. And so, according to Chazal, the Amorites hid in these caves, okay, specifically the one on the Moabite side of the valley. They had the intent of ambushing and killing the Jews. Essentially what they were going to do was either shoot arrows at them or throw large boulders upon them as they passed through. Now it's fascinating here that Chazal mentioned that the ark went ahead. We read this in the Torah, by the way, in Parsha Behalotecha. Now the ark, we know at this time, it contained the first set of luchot, the first set of broken tablets, okay, before they were replaced with the second set of tablets. And Chazal report that the ark would at least travel at a distance of 3 days ahead of the people. In fact, they would say it would travel by itself, which is interesting. And according to this passage, it would press down the mountains like an iron and would spread them out towards each other until it turned into a valley. Now, what's fascinating about this passage here, Masechet Brachot, which is a Baraita, is that we find a similar story recorded in the Midrash. But the Midrash says it wasn't the ark. Rather, it was the pillar of fire and cloud that led the Jewish people in the wilderness. And it was that pillar of fire and cloud that leveled the mountains. I don't find a stira here, a contradiction. Why? Because the ark is nothing more than an allegory of God's presence manifested in this cosmic event of the Exodus, and that the pillar of cloud is essentially the very thing that the Jews saw that was protecting them, that was actually changing the topography of the earth or the lands at that location. Now, what's also fascinating from this, when it mentioned blood gush, which is obviously a reference to the Amorites' blood gushing out, but there's a hyperbole here, that it's not just recording the human blood of the Amorites gushing out. This is describing a change in the earth. And we just read from Velikovsky that according to the reports amongst the non-Jewish nations, the planet Venus calls water to turn blood red from its cosmic dust, which in turn calls earthquakes to cause mountains to change. We'll go back here to Velikovsky, in which he says the summit of mountainous Thrace received the name Haemus, and Apollodorus related to the tradition of the Thracians that the summit was so named because of the stream of blood which gushed out the mountain when the heavenly battle was fought between Zeus and Typhon. And Typhon, or Typhon, was struck by a thunderbolt. As it is also said that the city Egypt received a name for the same reason. Very, very similar to what we just read here in this Baraita Masechet Brachot. So the rabbinical account of the Canes of Arnon really is a continuous event of the cataclysmic upheaval that unfolded during yetziat Mitzrayim, the plagues, etc. This is all the same event, and as we're going to see here from Masechet Brachot, this event continues all the way until the days of Joshua. And so the ark, or the pillar of fire, the cloud, etc., the level mountains, is a metaphor. Yes, it represents HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but really it's describing the planet Venus that Hashem used to cause dramatic changes in the planets. That's what it's describing. We continue on, and the question is asked, Avnei El Gavish, large stones. What's that mean? When one comes across the large stones, they have to say a blessing like crossing the Red Sea. What does it mean? The Baraita said, these are stones that remain, check this out, suspended in midair for the sake of Al Gav Ish, for the sake of a man. Oh, okay, for the sake of a man, and later it came down for the sake of a man. What does that mean? Well, what I want to point out here is that in Hebrew, the word El Gavish is homiletically rendered as a contraction of Al Gav Ish, which means for the sake of a man. Now, Al in Hebrew, Ain Lamed, means upon or above. Gav, okay, it could be for the sake of or for. Ish is man. So, Al Gavish is Al Gav Ish. It means this event happened for the sake of a man. So, Al Gavish, these large stones, are not just large sediments. These are meteorites that fell or come down for the sake of a righteous man. So sages go on. They later came down for the sake of a man. They're suspended for the sake of a man. And it says they remain suspended in midair for the sake of a man. Who is this man? This man is Moshe Rabbeinu. For it's written over there in the Torah, in Numbers chapter 12:3. It says there that Moshe was exceedingly humble. And see, we find a connection here with the word Ish, which means man in Hebrew. And likewise, it says in Exodus chapter 9:33, that when Moshe prayed for the plague of Barad, the meteorites to end, what's it say there? It mentions afterwards, it says that the Kolot in Barad ceased and rain did not reach the earth. Any meteorites that were falling to earth were suspended in midair. They later descended for the sake of another man. This refers to Yehoshua ben Nun, for it says in Numbers chapter 27, verse 18. It says that you shall kach lecha et Yehoshua ben Nun ish asher ruach bo. Take for yourself Yehoshua ben Nun, an ish, a man in whom there is spirit. Also, it is written in Joshua 10:11, when it says it happened when they, I shouldn't say flesh before Israel. Let me take a look at the Hebrew right here. It happened, benusam mipnei bnei Israel chim b'morad. Okay, it happened when they fought before Israel. Okay, they were on the descent of Beit Horan. When, and so this is describing the battles underneath Joshua. There was a typo on my behalf. Sorry about that. It says in Beit Horan, and it mentions afterwards, Hashem did what? Hishlich alehem. He sent upon them, meaning the enemies of Israel, avanim gudolot. He sent upon them large stones. Now, it doesn't say over here, avnei el gavish, but it does mention avanim gidolot, very large stones, which are interpreted as meteorites, is what is being interpreted here. Now, this is a very fascinating piece of Maimar Chazal here. Why? Check this out. This is mind-blowing. When I was reading this, I was like, whoa. What's interesting about Yetziat Mitzrayim being connected to planetary upheaval, meaning Venus coming into contact with Earth, is that according to Sefer Yehezqel, there's going to be another planetary upheaval in which Hashem is going to use Avnei El Gavish, meteorites, during Melchemet Gog and Magog, during the war of Gog and Magog. Take a look at this. Ezekiel 38, 17 through 23. K'amar Adonai Elokim, so says Hashem Elokim. He says, Hata hu asher dibarti biyamim. Are you the one whom I spoke in when? Kadmonim, in earlier days and years ago, that I would bring you against them? It shall be on that day. On which day? On the day in which Gog comes to the soil, to the land of Israel, the word of Hashem Elohim. My raging anger will flare up, for in my vengefulness, in the fire of my fury, I have spoken. I swear on that day, a great earthquake will take place upon the soil of Israel. Now, once again, these are passages that you get all types of people interpreting. You know, I don't want to say studio, God bless people in innocence, but people don't know what they're talking about. It's World War III, it's World War 55, it's this, it's that, yada, 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 right? Pay attention. This is a planetary upheaval, people, okay? Yes, you may have a war happening, rumors of war happening, but this is all connected to a cataclysmic event, a cosmic shift per se, an earthquake. It's been proven, if you study the sun, you can also learn when earthquakes will happen. Goes on to say, they will quake before me. Who? V'degei hayam, the fish of the sea will be affected by this. Ve'of hashemayim, the birds of the heaven. V'chayat hasadeh, the beasts of the field. V'chol haremes haromes, and every creeping thing, insects, reptiles, on the ground, and el ha'adamah v'chol ha'adam asher al panei ha'adamah, and every human being that is on the face of the earth, every human being, people. The mountains will be broken and cliffs will topple and every wall will topple to the ground. The book of Ezekiel is describing to you a massive cataclysmic shift hitting the earth, just like it happened during Yetziat Mitzrayim. It goes on to say, God says, V'karati alav l'cho harai cher neum Adonai Elokim. I will summon a sword against him to all my mountains. The word of Hashem Elohim. Each man's sword will be against his brother. And this is where people get caught up in interpreting war for Gog and Magog, right? But read in context. God says, I will punish him with pestilence and with blood. Sounds similar? Pestilence and blood. Dever uvadam. That's the same thing like what we'd read in the Exodus regarding the plagues. Pestilence, boils that were chemically induced from planetary interference that caused the boils upon the Mitzrayim and also Jews as they didn't heed to the mitzvot of Hashem. Torrential rain, that's also V'geshem shotef, that's also caused by cataclysmic changes in which people see floods and other things that happen. And what's this? V'avne el gavish, ash, fire, v'gafrit, amtir. God says, and meteorites, fire, and sulfur will I rain down love upon him. And upon his cohorts, and upon the many peoples who are with him, I will be exalted, I will be sanctified, I will make myself known before the eyes of many nations. They will know that I am Hashem. What was, will be. In Kol Chadash Tachat Hashemesh, friends, exactly what we see here is not a coincidence, and the Baraita recorded it. That there will be some type of astronomical event, some type of cosmic upheaval that will take place towards the end of days, mirroring exactly what it was during Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, regarding the meteorites of the seventh plague, Barad, we find in the Egyptian document of the Yipparar papyrus, it recorded how the land of Mitzrayim was turned into a complete wasteland. In fact, what we see of Mitzrayim today, the desert, that's a shell of its former glory. It says here in chapter 9, 2-3 of the Yipparar, trees are destroyed, no fruits, no herbs are found. Torah tells us that as well. Grain has perished on every side. That has perished which yesterday was seen, meaning what used to be is no more. The land is left to its weariness like the cutting of flax. It's gone. Now, Emanuel Veliskoski, he also records how this was infected, this event also impacted the nations. He says, the description of such a catastrophe is found in the Visuddhimagga, a Buddhist text on the world cycles. It describes that when a world cycle is destroyed by wind, and this wind he's talking about is not just windstorms, this is talking about hurricane force winds that are caused by planetary interference. And he says, there arises in the beginning of a cycle destroying great cloud. I put an asterisk mark to cloud because what do we read in the Torah? Hashem is described being associated with this cloud, this Anan, that descends on Mount Sinai, that is leading the people to the wilderness, leveling mountains. Okay? This harbinger of destruction, if you will. And from it, there arises a wind to destroy the world cycle. And he also says, in the Mexican annuals de Yucatelin, describes how a cosmic catastrophe, and this annuals here is from the Aztecs, by the way. It describes how a cosmic catastrophe was accompanied by meteorites. And the oral tradition of the Indians, likewise, the motif is repeated about meteorites that destroyed the world. So this is just barely scratching the surface. This is just breaking the ice, okay? And I wanted to put this brief teaching together. I was trying to get it out before the start of Pesach, but due to time constraints, there's a lot more because there's things that many of you probably never heard of, and sounds very interesting. There's maybe some things you guys think is, maybe too far out there because it's cognitive dissonance to how you learn science, right? But one of the things I'll recommend for a lot of people is to go pick up Veliskoski's writings. I have a whole library of his teachings. And once again, this individual was considered a heretic, and then he was later considered a scientific prophet. Such term could be used here. But he had great insight and understanding, and he attempted to explore understanding things of this world that many people don't understand. And with that said, as we come to an end of this teaching, there's so much more I can add onto here, but B'ezras Hashem, this is something I'd like to get into. There's a lot of things to go into, and it requires multiple parts. And so, God willing, is something I've been working on. And as I have more time, I'll try to get into it because there's certain things that you have to see. There's videos, there's other documents that you have to be referred to. The concept of electric universe is another thing that mainstream science is not very fond of. What it does is it deals with certain phenomenon or anomalies in the solar system that the scientific world doesn't really have explanations of. They have theories of, but they don't have any proven facts, such as the craters on the moon. Where are they from, right? Or why is it that when you take a look at the planet Mars or Jupiter, specifically at the northern part of Jupiter, there's these hexagram type shapes, right? They don't know, but they appear throughout the galaxy. Where do they cause from? And what these are actually caused from are electrical charges. The Earth is a very electrical thing, which is very interesting. In Yehezqel's vision, he starts to see things through what's called a chashmal. Chashmal is what we use in modern Hebrew for electricity. It's a very deep connection of spiritual insight. But there's things that you have to understand. And Veliskoski's thing on documenting the other religions and histories go into great detail of these concepts. And so, B'ezras Hashem, with God's help, this is something I like to go further into the future and have it in multiple parts because it's connected to, obviously, Pesach, Passover, but it goes deeper than that. And it also, in a way, it's a very controversial subject because Veliskoski, as a Jew, may not have been on the same doctrine, per se, of his other Jewish counterparts. Not that the Jewish world rejects him. I'm not sure how much of the Jewish world knows of his writings. He was very familiar with a lot of the rabbinical writings, like I said, in the Talmud, the Torah, the different rabbinical commentaries, the Vilna Gaon, and things of that nature. Knew his stuff, but I wouldn't say he shares the same belief as every Orthodox Jew out there, for that matter, because his take on the Torah and Hashem, that the revelation of God, as we know, came through this event, this cataclysmic cosmic event. And so that means that he may have different views, and that's fine, right? But it's very, very insightful. And before I sign off here, what I want to point out something is very interesting, okay? That the events that happened then are pretty much laying the groundwork of what's happening in today's day and age. We're currently living in a time in which you have people talking about climate change. The world is heating up. The world will be no more. It's all politically motivated and all this other striot. Okay? In fact, when Yehezqel started to gain a lot of ground and people started realizing how accurate this guy was, the ivory palaces of scientific academia had to do something. And what did they do? They appointed the late Carl Sagan, a man of great knowledge himself. But they appointed Carl Sagan to be an antagonist of Yehezqel to attempt to disprove and debunk him. And so basically one of the things Carl Sagan tried to argue about Yehezqel's view on Venus affecting the Earth and the Exodus and all the things about overheating, I haven't scratched the surface, man. I mean, there's a section here Yehezqel has from all around the world, what you and I would call napalm, aluminium naphthenate. Okay, he breaks down from the Aramaic and mentions that the petroleum oils that use in our world today came from Venus. That the oils that seeped into the rocks, okay, in the parts of the Middle East came from Venus. It's mind-blowing how he shares this and how people from the Indians, etc., attempted to save themselves by jumping into bodies of water in which they melted the skin to death. And this reminds me of passages in the prophet Zechariah where it says the flesh in the eye socket will decay within the eyes will decay in the eye socket. And people look at this as possibly some type of nuclear weapon going off. No, I don't think so. I think that what you're talking about in the prophets is pretty much what was familiar to Jewish history going back to the Exodus. Jewish history is cyclical. And that means that this refers to something cosmic in nature with the planets that's having an effect. But Carl Sagan attempted to debunk him by saying that, oh, you know, the planet Venus was dealing with carbon emissions. You know, the carbon emissions were going up, like the same garbage argument we hear with the political climate activists today. Oh, well, you know, we got to stop cows from passing gas and cars from driving. We need 15-minute cities and less this, less that. Or, you know, Bill Gates needs to block out the sun. Shtuyot. First and foremost, from what I know, they don't have any factories and cars on Mars, okay, or Venus, for that matter, since we're talking about that planet. So that automatically is dismissed. And it's been proven time and time again that the world has been hotter in the past than it is today. In fact, it's much cooler in many areas, but when you have mainstream media being funded by, you know, a small group of people, you can push whatever agenda you want down the throats of people who are gullible and naive, that don't research on their own because they're stuck in TikTok or Instagram all day. So with that said, Carl Sagan's attempt to debunk him failed miserably. Okay, and so the Earth heating, as Yehezqel writes it, was from this interaction between Venus coming out of existence into existence from Jupiter, and Venus, which is interesting, is a sibling to Titan, which is over near Jupiter, if I'm not mistaken. They're identical to each other. Okay, meaning that this is a planet, a comet that became a planet associated with another body in our solar system. So I mention that because we live in a day and age in which you have climate activists saying the world is going to be this and that. Why do I mention that? Because I believe the powers that be in this world, they know the truth. They know what happened in the past. They know that something's going to happen in the future. And I believe everything that we're witnessing right now, and we have experienced in these past couple of years in which there have been massive censorship, okay, on social media, on the political stage, is an attempt to quiet people because there's an agenda. Everything that we saw 3 years ago with the Wuhan virus thing, right? That was all an orchestrated event by members of the deep state to attempt to change the narrative of not just climate control, but population control. It was a narrative to attempt to say that something would happen to this world in which millions of people were killed off. But how did they do it? By artificially engineering a disease, unleashing it to the public, and creating some garbage thing that you inject in your arm, and it causes massive health complications that eventually kill people off or be stuck on pharmaceutical aid for the rest of their life. And then you have members of an economic forum write a book about reset, that we're entering into the fourth industrial revolution, and that you come up with 15-minute cities, and that how you can benefit communities and society by having little biospheres to live in. Because you know something's going to happen. And the more you can narrow the numbers down in humanity, the more lives you can quote unquote save, but you can also be in control of. And trust me, millions of people died in this event. And history will repeat itself, and millions of more people will perish as well. It is the nature of how things are underneath the divine providence of the Creator. Now, in the sense of faith, we see that the children of Israel were preserved, and there was people from other parts of the world that were preserved as well, that lived, that witnessed, and they wrote down what happened. A lot of this information is very suppressed because there's a control narrative. That's why our politicians have attempted to usurp and attempted to change the narrative on changing history, taking down statues and monuments and trying to re-educate people because they want to re-control our society. That's why they have tried to barricade a former presidential figure from coming into power. That's why they have you believing that Ukraine and Russia is this World War III, or that it's Armageddon, is Gog and Magog. It's more likely a group of politicians opposed to a deep state fascist Nazi movement, and therefore they're at war with them. And the idea that our country is trying to go to a digital dollar is only the writing on the wall of trying to control this utopian thing. So with that said, I don't want to get too much into a rant on what people think I'm spitting some type of bro science here. The point is with Pesach, and what we see is that when we sit down to Seder and we open the Haggadah, we're not just supposed to read words off the pages of Haggadah. We're supposed to understand, we're supposed to have impressed on our conscience the severity of the events that unfolded, the reality of those events, and that there will be another one happening. But the second part of the Seder is to engage us in preparation for that. And that are we creating the energy for that redemption? That we will be found protected in the shadow of the wings of the Most High. Okay, there's many things out there that people speculate about. Nobody has 100% the answer on. But I believe the more we become familiar with the events of the past, we can understand what will take place in the future, because future proves the past proves the future, whatever. They're tied together. And so with that said, that's going to bring me to a close here for the teaching on Pesach. I hope that you've been somewhat intrigued by this teaching, blessed, challenged, maybe upset, I don't know. And once again, if our organization is a blessing to you, prayerfully consider donating. You can find the links directly below the video there. And we thank you in advance for your financial support. We do appreciate it. And like I said, I did want to have this teaching out in time before the start of Pesach, but just due to time constraints, okay? You know, that's the only thing that's going on. So God willing, I'll try to be updating these and releasing them, and it has a lot more information. And if you have any questions pertaining to what you heard here, send me an email and I answer them in the order that they come in. Until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom, Chag, Kasher v'Sameach, happy kosher Passover, and Kol Tuv. Blessings to all.